Can you name the number one scoring tight end of Week 6? Anthony Ferkser. Sure, why not? Fantasy football is crazy sometimes. We're getting you ready for Week 7 on the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. What's up, everybody? My name is Steven Andrus, joined by Jordan Cohn and Jesse Pantusco from the Radio.com Sports staff. It is the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. Each and every week, we bring you Pick 'em Up, the Stream Team, and Stealthy starts. And we begin, as always, with Pick 'em Up, our waiver wire options for week number 7. Players owned in less than 50% of leagues that should be picked up for this upcoming schedule. We mentioned in previous weeks, Jerick McKinnon, he's less than 60% owned. Raheem Mostert had an injury. See if he's available. Henry Ruggs coming off the bye for the Raiders, still less than 60% owned. See if he's available. But the number one waiver wire option for me this week is Bengals running back Giovani Bernard. Joe Mixon left week 6 twice with a foot injury. He tried to play through it, but could not continue with about 8 minutes left in the game. Giovani Bernard had 11 touches, including 3 receptions and a goal line touchdown. He gets the Cleveland Browns in week number 7. Bernard is a must start in games where Mixon is out. In fact, I would consider him a top 15 running back option in week 7 if Mixon is out of this one. Bernard has played 60% of snaps 6 times since Mixon came into the league. In those games, he's averaged more than 19 fantasy points per game. He is a slam dunk, high ceiling handcuff. Jordan, who are you picking up this week?
Yeah, Steven, I'm going to go on a similar wavelength as you. Miles Sanders exited the Eagles' Week 6 game against the Ravens, and so Boston Scott, his backup, is someone that I'm looking for on the waivers. He's performed well in an increased role with his brief stint with the Eagles. In the 3 games in 2019 where he had at least 10 touches, he had 86 yards, 87 yards and a score, and 58 yards with 3 scores in those 3 outings, all of which were viable fantasy performances. And despite the Eagles' struggles, they seem like a much more competent football team, in my opinion, than the Giants, who they're slated to face in Week 7 on a short week. And their line is currently, they're the 5.5-point favorites. And I think that's a line that will probably move more in their favor, meaning that the game flow could be a positive one for Scott.
The calendar says fall, but I'm declaring it Tim Patrick season in fantasy. Patrick, who is owned in just 18% of Yahoo leagues, led the Broncos with 101 yards on 4 catches Sunday at New England and has gone over 100 yards in each of his last 2 games. He's seen 15 targets during that span, more than he had in his previous 3 games combined. With Courtland Sutton lost to a torn ACL and tight end Noah Fant also on the shelf with a sprained ankle, Patrick's only competition for targets at the moment is first-round rookie Jerry Jeudy, whose career high is only 62 yards. Drew Lock looked a little rusty in his return from a 2-game injury absence Sunday, but in time, he should be a market improvement on fill-in starter Brett Rickman. We'll see if Patrick, an undrafted 4th-year player out of Utah, can keep this up, but given his recent success, I think he needs to be owned in all formats.
Yeah, Broncos offense is a little sneaky this year, right? They've had some injuries, but they still have players that keep continuing to perform. So a very under-the-radar fantasy asset there in Tim Patrick. Let's move on to the stream team for week number 7. This is a quarterback, tight end, and defense owned in less than 50% of leagues that we think you could not only pick up, but start in week 7 based on the matchup. And we begin with our top streaming quarterback.
Yeah, so I'm going to go with Teddy Bridgewater for Week 7. He's matched up against the New Orleans Saints. The worst quarterback performance against the Saints this season came in Week 1. Tom Brady, he had 23 fantasy points. That is the worst week that a quarterback has put up against the Saints in terms of fantasy value. Since then, Derek Carr, Aaron Rodgers, and Matt Stafford each had 3 touchdown games for at least 27 points. Most recently, Justin Herbert went off, setting a rookie record for Monday Night Football, having 4 touchdowns, 34 fantasy points against the Saints. All in all, the 5 quarterbacks have combined for 15 touchdowns and 3 interceptions against this very vulnerable Saints secondary. And furthermore, Bridgewater is someone whose wheels can come into play, which you can't really say about the 5 quarterbacks I mentioned previously. In Week 6, he had 8 carries for 48 yards, a modest total, but 4.8 fantasy points ain't nothing. I'll gladly take that added on to the end of my total. And so Bridgewater is someone who I'm looking to stream in Week 7.
You got to respect a quarterback that wears 2 gloves. I mean, it's an underrated asset when it comes to your quarterbacking in 2020. My top streaming tight end for this week is really a waiver wire ad as well. He's been forgotten about from injury, but Philadelphia Eagles tight end Dallas Goedert is eligible to come off of IR in week 7, Thursday night against the Giants. He'd been coming back from what was described as a small ankle fracture. I'm not sure there's such a thing as a small fracture, but he is eligible to come back in week 7. Zach Ertz in week 6 was banged up. He was hobbling all over the field if you were watching that Eagles-Ravens game in the second half. And Goedert, week 1, 8 catches, 101 yards, and a touchdown on 9 targets. Week 2, 8 more targets. And against the Giants in week 17 a year ago, the Eagles targeted Goedert 10 times in a must-win game to make the playoffs. So keep an eye on him. He should be back off of IR this week. If he's not, my backup streaming tight end option is Texans tight end Jordan Akins, who should get the starting job back from Darren Fells when healthy.
This might seem reckless, but I think the Cowboys defense is actually in play as a streaming option this week. First, the elephant in the room. There's no sugarcoating it. The Cowboys defense has been awful this year, allowing a league-high 36 points per game. But this week, they faced one of the worst offenses, the Washington football team, who have averaged an anemic 18 points per game this season, including 16.2 during their current 5-game losing skid. Washington starts turnover-prone quarterback Kyle Allen, who was intercepted and also committed a costly fumble in Sunday's loss to the Giants. Those miscues bring Allen's turnover count to 25 since the start of last year. Obviously, the Cowboys defense has had a rough go of it, but they did put up 9 fantasy points thanks to Anthony Brown's fumble return touchdown in week 5. This is a get-right spot for Dallas against a team that's allowed a league-high 24 sacks this year.
All right, let's move on to stealthy starts for week number 7. Players started in less than 50% of leagues in recent weeks, but based on the matchup, we think you can plug into your lineup for week number 7. We mentioned Jerick McKinnon earlier in the show. Mentioned him again. If Raheem Mostert is out, he left Sunday Night Football with an ankle injury. McKinnon instantly becomes a top 15 running back. Justin Jefferson of the Vikings was started in less than 50% of leagues last week. This is a guy, he's a stud at this point. You got to start him every week moving forward. But my official stealthy start for week number 7, Justin Jackson, the Chargers running back, coming off a bye week, still less than 55% owned. You might even be able to pick this guy up. Austin Eckler is still out. In the first full game with Eckler out, Justin Jackson had 20 touches, including 5 receptions for 94 total yards. Compare that to Joshua Kelly, the rookie, who only had 12 touches, only 1 reception for 38 yards. Kelly also has fumbling concerns that could find him the bench in the middle of a game. I like Justin Jackson's matchup. He gets week 7 against the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Jags allow the 5th most fantasy points to running backs. They've also allowed 9 touchdowns to running backs, tied for most in the league this season.
Well, Brandin Cooks has not been the model of consistency this year. His outcomes have ranged from 0 to 161 yards, but I think he could have one of his ceiling games against the Packers in week 7. Cooks won his first 4 games without a touchdown, but has scored each of the past 2 weeks, totaling 229 yards on a combined 21 targets during that span. This week's game sets up as a shootout. We know the Texans will have to throw early and often to keep pace with the Packers, who have averaged over 32 points per game. For me, though, the kicker is Jair Alexander. He's one of the top corners in football and will likely match up with Will Fuller. In a similar situation with Marcus Peters shadowing Fuller in week 2, Fuller goose-egged while Cooks had one of his best games this season, exploding for 95 yards on 5 catches. Given those factors, I'd feel very comfortable firing Cooks up as a week 7 starter.
Yeah, Jair, number 1 cornerback rating by Pro Football Focus this year, held Calvin Ridley to no catches. Mike Evans, just 1 catch for 10 yards. So targeting the receiver who is not getting Jair's great strategy so far this season. Jordan, how about you?
Well, I just want to say I feel like these are slightly personal jabs at me for benching both Justin Jefferson and Brandin Cooks this week in our RDC Fantasy League. But that's besides the point. I'll probably start them. Yeah, exactly. And a loss to Jesse. I'll probably start them going forward. But the guy that I'm choosing this week for my stealthy start, he's going to take a little bit more chutzpah, if you will, to start because he hasn't been very good. I'm going to go with Detroit's Marvin Jones. He has a total of 146 yards and 1 touchdown on the entire season. So he hasn't really done much from a fantasy standpoint. However, in week 7, he may not only be a viable fantasy option, he might be a top ceiling option as well. A little bit of recent history. Last year, Marvin Jones had 2 catches for 17 yards on 5 targets in his 5th game of the season. He followed that up with 10 catches, 13 targets, 4 touchdowns. This week, his 5th game of the season, he had 2 catches for 8 yards on 5 targets. Am I saying he's going to have a 4 touchdown game? No. But he's had other explosive efforts before that have come out of nowhere. 117 yards and 2 touchdowns in 2018, 205 yards and 2 touchdowns in 2016. This guy can explode at any given moment, and he has the perfect opportunity to do so in week 7 against the Falcons defense, who have given up big games to multiple wide receivers several weeks this season, including Lockett and Metcalf in week 1, Jefferson and Thielen most recently in week 6. If you've got the guts, if you've got a receiver on bye, I think that Marvin Jones is someone that you can go with.
That's going to do it for this week's episode of the Radio.com Sports Fantasy Football Show. As always, if you have fantasy football questions, you have a trade that you're thinking about, you can ask us questions in the comments section of our YouTube page of this video. We'll be happy to answer it for you. But for Jesse Pantusco, for Jordan Cohn, I'm Steven Andress. Good luck in week number 7.